In November 1891, a 32-year-old widow named Margaret Thornhill received 30 days to abandon the only home she had ever known. Her husband's family demanded the land returned. Their argument was blunt. She held no claim, bore no children, earned no income, carried no value. The farm sat in northern Wisconsin, 12 miles beyond a settlement called Ember Ridge. Winter was 3 weeks out. 87 acres of mixed woodland and pasture comprised the property. A single-room cabin fitted with a stone chimney, a woodshed, and a small barn that listed slightly eastward. Most folks in town figured she'd fled south toward Madison or Milwaukee, or gone begging at the church door for charity. But Margaret didn't leave. She stayed. What she did next would become one of the most extraordinary survival accounts ever documented in that county's history. Margaret's husband, Thomas Thornhill, had succumbed to pneumonia the previous spring, April 14th. He'd been 40 years old, built like a draft horse. The sickness devoured him in 6 days. His brothers showed up within a month, legal papers in hand, signed by their father. Their eyes were cold. They looked at Margaret the way a man looks at furniture he's already decided to burn. The deed, they told her, had always remained in Thomas's father's name. Thomas had been nothing more than a tenant, and she, a woman bearing no blood relation, no children, possessed no legal standing to remain. When she refused to go, they severed every lifeline. Firewood deliveries from the main family plot stopped. Shared grain from the mill stopped. They ceased acknowledging her existence entirely. Neighbors whispered among themselves. Some felt pity. Others called her a fool strangling on her own pride. A woman alone on frozen land, armed with nothing but a small woodshed, a single Holstein cow named Bess, and 14 chickens. No savings, no relatives within 200 miles, and winter in northern Wisconsin could claim a healthy man in under 3 hours if he wasn't prepared. The record low in Ember Ridge had struck minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, logged in January 1888. People still spoke of that winter in hushed tones. 4 souls froze to death. But Margaret carried something no one in that town suspected. Her father, Joseph Weir, had spent 18 years as a coal miner in southwestern Pennsylvania before uprooting his family westward in 1868. He descended into shafts plunging 300 feet beneath the surface, where air ran thin and darkness swallowed everything whole. He taught his daughter a lesson most human beings never receive: how to transform the earth itself into a furnace. She was just 15 when he demonstrated how miners survived cave-ins by carving small survival pockets underground, how they harnessed body heat and the thermal mass of stone to endure sub-zero conditions, how certain clay-rich soils could insulate more effectively than wood, brick, even wool. One winter night, seated beside the fire, he told her plainly, __, quote, _0, __. But 6 feet down, the earth holds steady between 55 and 70 degrees through every winter month. January or July makes no difference. The ground remembers warmth. Those words had never left her. And now, 23 years later, she intended to stake her life on them. Margaret drove her spade into the ground on November 3rd, 1891. She selected a spot directly beneath the woodshed, a structure measuring 10 feet by 12 feet, resting on 6 flat limestone foundation stones rather than a proper footing. The shed had gone up in 1884, used for storing split firewood, tools, and a small grinding wheel. Beneath it lay a mixture of sandy loam and clay, dark, rich, still yielding enough to break with a blade. Barely. Within a week, the frost line would push downward and the soil would harden to iron. There was no margin for delay. She dug through daylight hours, working in 2-hour shifts to stave off exhaustion. Soil came out one wooden bucket at a time, roughly 12 pounds per load, scattered deep among the woods behind the property where fresh dirt would draw no attention. Nobody visited. Nobody inquired. The nearest neighbours were a Swedish family named the Lunrons, living 1.5 miles to the south. Margaret laboured alone. Her palms blistered, her spine burned, her breath hung in white clouds against the cold. 9 days in, she had hollowed out a chamber, 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, 5 feet deep at its centre. The walls were raw earth, smooth and vertical, compressed tight beneath the flat of her spade. The ceiling overhead was nothing more than the woodshed's floor, held aloft by the original beams. She reinforced those beams with 2 additional crossbars salvaged from a collapsed fence near the property line. Both hewn from oak, still sound despite 2 decades of exposure. But Margaret didn't stop there. She understood something critical. Even underground, a sealed chamber would kill her. Without ventilation, she'd suffocate within hours. Moisture from her own breath would condense on the walls, turning everything damp and frigid. So she fashioned a ventilation shaft from a length of old stovepipe she discovered rusting near the barn. 4 inches in diameter, 6 feet long. She angled it upward from the rear corner of the chamber, threading it through a gap she dug near the woodshed's back wall. The outlet she disguised by stacking firewood around it. The airflow was subtle, but functional. Cold air sank in through the trapdoor whenever she opened it. Warm air rose slowly through the pipe. Together they created a gentle circulation that kept the space breathable without bleeding too much heat. She lined the floor with 8 inches of dry straw, stockpiled in the barn since September, then layered it with 3 wool blankets she'd stitched together from old coats, a quilt her mother had made in 1872, and 2 deer hides Thomas had tanned 3 years prior. Soft, insulating, waterproof. In the northwest corner of the chamber, she constructed a small clay oven from river stones gathered at a creek bed 1/2 mile distant. Each stone was the size of a grapefruit, smooth, dense, selected deliberately for its capacity to absorb and radiate heat. She mortared them with a mixture of clay, soil, water and wood ash, a technique her father had taught her. The oven itself was no larger than a bread box, its interior volume roughly 1 cubic foot. But efficiency was its design principle. A small firebox sat at the base. A cooking surface occupied the middle. A flue vented through a second stovepipe. This one angled upward through a natural crack she'd widened in the shed's back wall. The entire system was brilliant in its simplicity. She could burn sticks no thicker than her thumb and produce enough heat to warm 6 large stones. Those stones, heated to approximately 300 degrees Fahrenheit, could be wrapped in cloth and positioned around her sleeping area. They would radiate warmth for 4 to 6 hours. A single load of wood, weighing less than 3 pounds, could sustain her comfort through an entire night. Compare that to a traditional cast iron stove, which would devour 15 to 20 pounds of wood per night and surrender most of its heat through the chimney and the walls of a poorly insulated cabin. Margaret stored her food in wooden crates sealed with melted candle wax to guard against moisture and rodents. 40 pounds of dried navy beans, 20 pounds of salted pork wrapped in cheesecloth, 30 pounds of hardtack biscuits, 18 pounds of cornmeal, a small sack of dried apples, 2 jars of honey, not luxury, but enough. She collected snowmelt in a copper pot and boiled it on the clay oven, purifying it into safe drinking water. She brought Bess into the woodshed above her, constructing a pen from loose boards and packing straw around it for insulation. A 1,200-pound cow generates an enormous amount of body heat, roughly 15,000 BTUs per day. That heat climbed into the rafters, warmed the trapped air, and radiated downward through the floorboards into Margaret's chamber below. Each night, she descended through a trap door she'd cut into the floor with a handsaw, 2 feet by 3 feet, hinged with leather straps. She pulled it shut above her, latched it from below with a wooden peg, and slept in the earth. Every one of these meticulous calculations was about to face a brutal test. By mid-November, the temperature outside plunged to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside her shelter, it held near 55. People in town noticed thin, steady smoke still rising from the woodshed, but they assumed she was burning through her last supply of firewood. Everyone knew Thomas's brothers had cut her off. Everyone knew she had no money to buy more. In mid-November, 2 women from the Lutheran church, Mrs. Greta Holgren and Mrs. Ann Pison, stopped by carrying a wicker basket, half a loaf of bread, 4 eggs, a small jar of preserves. They discovered Margaret outside, hacking ice from the water trough with the blunt end of an axe. She wore a wool coat that had belonged to Thomas. Her hands were red, raw, her face thinner than either woman remembered. She thanked them with quiet politeness, took the basket, offered no explanation. She didn't ask them inside. One of the women later told the pastor, Reverend William Cord, quote, _1, nobody did. Thomas's brothers showed up once in late November, the day before Thanksgiving. 2 of them. Edward, the eldest, 38 years old and devoid of humour. James, 35, who had always regarded Margaret with something bordering on contempt. They planted themselves outside the woodshed in the bitter air, breath curling white, and hollered that she was trespassing on family land. Margaret stayed silent. She was below, in the chamber, listening. They assumed she cowered inside the shed, too frail or too stubborn to face them. Edward drove his boot into the door once, hard, then stopped. James laughed. One of them spoke loud enough to carry. "Let the winter have her. Save us the trouble." They left. Margaret lay in the darkness, hands folded across her chest, and said nothing. December arrived fast, and it arrived savage. The first major storm struck on the 8th, a low-pressure system barreling in from the Dakotas. 6 inches of snow fell overnight, heavy and sodden. The temperature plunged to 9 degrees Fahrenheit, then 0, then kept dropping. By December 14th, it had reached -12. Wind tore shingles from rooftops across Ember Ridge. The general store sold its last drop of lamp oil. The blacksmith's forge cracked. People stopped venturing outside unless survival demanded it. The second storm rolled through 3 days later, on December 17th. This one buried everything. 18 inches of snow accumulated in 36 hours. Winds screamed at 40 miles per hour, sculpting drifts that climbed to window sills and sealed doors shut. Then the cold descended, a physical weight pressing the land flat. -18, -23. On December 20th, 1891, the thermometer bottomed out at -31 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest reading in 15 years. The sky was utterly clear. Stars glittered like shards of ice, and the wind, constant, merciless, hammered the wind chill down to -50. Families devoured their firewood far faster than planned. A cord of seasoned hardwood that should have lasted a month vanished in 2 weeks. Chimneys fractured from rapid temperature swings. Iron pipes froze solid, then burst, flooding homes with water that turned to ice within minutes. 3 houses lost their roofs beneath the crushing weight of snow. One belonged to the Beckers, a family of German immigrants with 5 children. The roof caved in at 2 in the morning. No one was injured, but they lost everything they owned. They crowded into relatives' homes and slept on bare floors. A man named Samuel Court, a farmer in his 50s, attempted to walk from his house to his barn to check on his horses during the storm on December 21st. The distance, 70 feet. He covered half of it before the cold seized him. His legs failed, his vision dissolved. He pitched forward into the snow, face first. His 16-year-old son, Daniel, found him an hour later. Unconscious, lips blue, fingers frozen rigid. They hauled him inside and thawed him beside the fire. He survived, but he lost 4 fingers on his right hand and 2 toes on his left foot. The town doctor, Albert Fenway, removed them with a bone saw on Christmas Eve. 2 children in a family south of town, a boy of 7, a girl of 4, died from cold exposure when their fireplace went dark during the night of December 22nd. Their parents had collapsed into sleep, spent from days of splitting frozen wood. The fire dwindled to coals, then ash, then nothing. By morning, the air inside the house measured 12 degrees. The children never woke. The funeral came 3 days later. The ground was frozen too deep to accept graves. The coffins were placed in the church basement to wait for spring. Otto Reinhardt, the town carpenter, exhausted his firewood supply on December 22nd. He and his wife Ingrid and their 2 daughters, ages 9 and 11, pressed together beneath every blanket they owned. They burned chairs, they burned a table, they burned a cabinet. By December 23rd, the house had grown so cold that breath hung visible indoors, white clouds forming with every exhale. Ingrid's hands trembled so violently she couldn't grip a cup. The girls wept from the cold, then fell silent. That silence was far worse. On Christmas Eve, desperate and half-frozen, Otto mentioned Margaret Thornhill. He told his wife, "She's still alive. I saw smoke 2 days ago." Ingrid stared at him as though he'd lost his mind. "4," she said. But Otto shook his head. So they made their decision. Christmas morning, they pulled on every garment they owned, swaddled the girls in blankets, and trudged 3 miles through knee-deep snow toward the Thornhill property. The woodshed still stood. A thin column of smoke climbed steady and pale from somewhere near the back. They knocked. No answer. Otto shoved the door open, hinges groaning against the cold. Inside, the cow stood calm in its pen, working a mouthful of straw, breath steaming into the dim air. The space smelled of animal hide, damp earth, and wood smoke, but it wasn't frozen. It was warm, warmer than Otto's own house had been in a full week. Ingrid drew a sharp breath. The girls stared, wide-eyed. Then Otto noticed the trapdoor cut into the floor. Margaret rose slowly through the opening, a tin lantern gripped in one hand. She was thin, thinner than before. Hair tied back, face streaked with soot. But she wasn't shivering. No frostbite marked her skin. Her eyes were sharp and clear. She studied them, the 2 trembling girls, Ingrid's shaking hands, and spoke quietly. Not a question, a diagnosis. Ingrid broke down weeping. Otto tried to respond, but his voice cracked apart. Margaret set the lantern on the ground. She led them down into the shelter. It was cramped and dim, lit only by the lantern's flicker and the dull amber glow of the clay oven. Low ceiling, bare earthen walls. The air tasted of clay, smoke, dried herbs, and warmth. Real warmth. The Reinhardt family stood motionless, stunned, feeling heat sink into their bodies for the first time in days. The stone oven radiated like something alive,